Oh, you can feel it, can't you? That shift in the air. That uncomfortable silence creeping up their spine. Because somewhere, at the very top, in a room your abuser will never enter, someone leaned forward, adjusted their cufflinks, and asked one simple question. Do you know who you hurt? And suddenly the laughter stopped. You see, they thought you were small. They thought you were weak. They thought your silence meant surrender. But what they didn't understand, what they still don't understand, is that pain doesn't break everyone. Sometimes it builds something terrifyingly powerful. Oh, they don't know yet. They don't know who you're becoming in the dark. They don't know who's been watching. They don't know that every insult, every betrayal, every calculated wound was being recorded, not by cameras, but by consequence. And now the question isn't about what they did. The question is, what happens when the truth climbs higher than their lies? Tonight, we're not talking about revenge. We're talking about revelation, about exposure, about the moment the powerful are forced to confront the damage they dismissed. Because someone at the top just asked your abuser a question, and they don't know yet, but they're about to. They mistook your silence for surrender. That was their first mistake. People who cause damage often believe that the loudest voice in the room is the strongest one. They believe that if you don't fight back immediately, if you don't scream, if you don't expose them on the spot, then you must be powerless. But silence is not proof of weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes silence is survival. And sometimes silence is the furnace where strength is forged. You stayed quiet not because you didn't feel the impact, but because you felt it too deeply to waste your energy reacting impulsively. You understood something they didn't. Reacting gives them control. When they provoke and you explode, they feel powerful. When they hurt you and you collapse publicly, they feel justified. Your silence denied them that satisfaction. Your composure unsettled them more than any argument ever could. In the dark moments, when no one was clapping for you, when no one even knew what you were carrying, you were building endurance. Pain has a strange way of sharpening awareness. You started observing more, listening more, understanding patterns. You saw the manipulation, the insecurity behind the aggression, the fragility behind the dominance. While they were busy performing strength, you were developing it. There's a difference between someone who shouts to prove power and someone who doesn't need to. Silence forces you inward. It forces you to confront your fear, your anger, your self-doubt. And when you sit with those emotions instead of running from them, something shifts. You begin to master yourself. And self-mastery is a power no abuser can predict. They thought you were shrinking. In reality, you were recalibrating. You were choosing your battles. You were conserving your energy. You were learning that not every insult deserves a response. Not every attack deserves a defense. Sometimes the strongest move is restraint. Sometimes the most intimidating presence is the one that doesn't need to announce itself. Silence also gave you clarity. It showed you who stood with you and who stayed quiet for their own convenience. It revealed alliances, exposed intentions, and separated noise from truth. While they believed you were isolated, you were actually gathering perspective. And perspective is dangerous to those who thrive on deception. You didn't respond because you were weak. You responded by growing. You responded by evolving. You responded by refusing to let their behavior define your identity. That restraint required more courage than retaliation ever would. Anyone can react. Few can endure. Fewer still can endure and transform. What they failed to understand is that silent strength compounds. Every time you chose composure over chaos, you added another layer of resilience. Every time you swallowed the urge to lash out and instead chose discipline, You sharpened your control. And control, real control, is the ultimate form of power. They saw quiet. They assumed defeat. They never imagined that behind that quiet was calculation, awareness, and a rising force they couldn't measure. Silence was never your weakness. It was your preparation. They believed no one was watching. That's the arrogance of people who think they hold all the power. When someone operates from manipulation, control, or cruelty, they convince themselves that their actions disappear the moment the scene ends. They assume that, because there was no immediate consequence, there will be no consequence at all. But every action leaves a record, not always on paper, not always in a courtroom, but in memory, in reputation, in energy, in patterns that cannot stay hidden forever. Every word they used to belittle you carved an imprint. Every attempt to undermine your confidence revealed more about their character than your worth. People think harm evaporates if it isn't exposed instantly. They forget that impact travels. It echoes in the way you grew more observant. It echoes in the way others quietly noticed the tension, the disrespect, the imbalance. Even if no one confronted it at the time, the record was being written in real time. There is something about repeated behavior that exposes itself. You can fake kindness once. You can pretend to be fair for a short period. But consistent actions create undeniable patterns. Patterns speak louder than excuses. Over time, others begin to connect the dots. The charm starts to crack. The mask slips in small, almost invisible ways. And once people see it, they cannot unsee it. Every action also leaves a record within the person committing it. You cannot repeatedly harm someone without shaping yourself in the process. Cruelty rewires character. Dishonesty erodes integrity. Control breeds paranoia. The very behaviors they used against you begin to consume them from the inside. They become defensive without reason, suspicious without cause, tense without knowing why. The record isn't just external, it's internal. And then there's you. You kept mental notes, not for revenge but for clarity. You started recognizing the cycle, the tone shifts, the manipulation tactics, the predictable triggers you learned. You adapted. You stopped taking things personally and started seeing them strategically. That awareness became your evidence. Not necessarily for a public confrontation, but for your own awakening. Once you see the truth clearly, you can never be controlled the same way again. Reputation works quietly but powerfully. People observe how someone treats those they think are powerless. That observation becomes part of their unspoken profile. Opportunities close without explanation. Trust fades without announcement. Respect declines in rooms they aren't even present in. They may never know exactly when the shift happened, but it happens. Because actions accumulate, and accumulated behavior defines identity. Time is the ultimate archivist. It stores everything. It reveals everything. What feels hidden today becomes obvious tomorrow. What seems insignificant now becomes the missing piece later. The small dismissals, the private insults, the subtle manipulations, they build a narrative. And narratives travel further than any single event. They thought moments passed and disappeared. They didn't realize moments stack. They layer. They build weight. And eventually, that weight demands recognition. Nothing vanishes just because it was done quietly. Everything leaves a mark. Everything creates a trace. Every action writes a line in a story that cannot be erased, only revealed. They believed they were untouchable. That their position, their influence, their authority placed them beyond accountability. When someone stands on a temporary platform of power, it's easy for them to confuse access with superiority. They start thinking they are the final decision, the ultimate voice, the highest level in the room. But power always answers to higher power, whether visible or invisible, immediate or delayed. There is always another layer above the one they can see. Another system, Another authority. Another truth that outranks titles and temporary control. They may dominate a space, control a narrative, intimidate a circle, but they do not control the whole structure. No one does. And that realization is the crack in their confidence they never prepare for. Power built on fear is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It depends on silence, compliance, and the illusion that no one will question it. The moment someone higher begins to observe, even quietly, the entire foundation starts to shake, because false authority survives on isolation. It thrives when no one connects the dots. But when perspective widens, when oversight increases, when accountability rises, the performance becomes harder to sustain. They assumed you were the lowest point in the hierarchy. They treated you like you had no backing, no voice beyond their reach. What they didn't consider is that influence moves in ways they cannot track. Respect can exist in rooms they've never entered. Your integrity can speak to people they'll never meet. And when higher levels begin to evaluate character, rather than surface performance, everything shifts. There's also a deeper layer of higher power that doesn't require titles or organizations. It's the power of truth over time, the power of consequence over arrogance, the power of internal reckoning. You can outrun criticism. You can silence opposition. But you cannot permanently escape the weight of your own behavior. Eventually, reality audits everyone. And when that audit happens, excuses lose value. Those who misuse authority often underestimate how small they truly are in the grand structure of things. They forget that positions change, leadership rotates, environments evolve. What feels permanent today can disappear tomorrow. And when it does, what remains is reputation, character, record, the very things they neglected while focusing on control. Meanwhile, you learned something far more powerful. You learned patience. You learned that not every injustice requires immediate confrontation. Sometimes the most strategic move is to let the system reveal itself, to let time elevate the truth, to let higher levels notice what lower levels ignored. That patience isn't weakness. It's understanding hierarchy on a deeper scale. There is always oversight beyond what is obvious. Always evaluation beyond what is spoken. Always a higher standard than the one they created for themselves. They may have felt like the final authority in your story, but they were never the highest authority in the larger picture. And when that larger picture begins to come into focus, when greater forces begin to ask questions, when accountability rises from above, the illusion of untouchable power collapses under the weight of something far greater than them. It only takes one question to destabilize an entire illusion. Not an accusation, not a public exposure, just a question. Calm, direct, impossible to dodge. Do you know who you hurt? On the surface, it sounds simple, almost harmless. But beneath it lives something dangerous: awareness. Because that question forces reflection, and reflection is what people who cause harm avoid the most. They were comfortable when the focus stayed on control, on narratives they could twist, on versions of events they could manipulate. But a precise question cuts through noise. It shifts the spotlight from the victim's reaction to the aggressor's responsibility. It demands ownership. It demands consciousness. And the moment that demand enters the room, the power dynamic begins to change. Most people who harm others rely on justification. It wasn't that serious. You're too sensitive. That's just how I am. Excuses are shields. They deflect guilt and preserve ego. But a well-placed question slips past those shields. It doesn't attack. It exposes. It invites silence, the uncomfortable kind. The kind where they have to confront the gap between how they see themselves and what they've actually done. The question changes everything because it removes their favorite escape, denial. When someone asks, "Do you know who you hurt?" they are no longer debating facts. They are challenging awareness. Either the person knew and chose to proceed anyway, or they didn't know, which means they were careless enough not to notice the damage they were causing. Both answers carry weight. Both answers reveal something. And here's what makes it even more powerful. It centers your value. That question implies you mattered, that your pain was real, that your experience reached higher levels of attention. It reframes the narrative from, you were weak to, you were wronged. It transforms your silence from invisibility into evidence waiting to be acknowledged. When that question is asked in the right space, by someone with perspective, authority, or clarity, it disrupts comfort. It forces review. It invites scrutiny. Patterns get examined. Behaviors get reconsidered. Suddenly, what was dismissed as minor becomes significant. What was brushed aside as personal conflict becomes a matter of character. Questions are powerful because they linger. Statements can be argued with. Accusations can be denied, but questions echo. They replay in the mind long after the conversation ends. Do you know who you hurt? Becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable for those who have carefully curated an image. For you, that question represents a turning point. It means the narrative is no longer one-sided. It means awareness has entered the equation. It means someone is looking beyond surface performance and asking about impact. And impact is where truth lives. Everything can shift with a single moment of inquiry, a single pause, a single challenge to the story they've been telling themselves. Because once the question exists, it cannot be unheard. Once awareness is introduced, it cannot be completely suppressed. And from that point forward, the illusion of control is no longer as stable as it once seemed. They're still looking at the old version of you. That's the tragedy. That's the miscalculation. They think they understand you because they remember who you were when the pressure first hit. They remember the hesitation, the confusion, the silence. They think that snapshot is permanent. But people who underestimate growth always get blindsided by evolution. While they were comfortable, you were transforming. Pain has a way of accelerating development. When someone pushes you into a corner, they expect you to shrink. What they don't anticipate is adaptation. You started studying the environment, reading between lines, strengthening skills they never noticed because they were too focused on dominance. Every difficult moment became training. Every dismissal became fuel. Every betrayal became instruction. They don't know who you're becoming because growth rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, in early mornings, in private decisions, in boundaries you start setting without drama, in the way your tone changes, calmer, steadier, less reactive. They may sense something different, but they can't quite identify it. That uncertainty unsettles them. You're not reacting the same way anymore. You're not chasing validation. You're not explaining yourself endlessly. You're observing more than you speak. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic. When someone can no longer predict your emotional response, they lose leverage. And leverage was their favorite tool. They assume you're still affected the same way. They assume their words still land with the same force. What they don't realize is that you've built internal insulation. You've strengthened your self-concept. You've separated their opinion from your identity. That separation is power. Once you stop internalizing someone's projection, their control weakens dramatically. Growth also sharpens discernment. You see manipulation faster. You recognize patterns earlier. You trust your instincts more. You no longer ignore red flags just to keep peace. That awareness changes your posture. It changes your energy. You carry yourself differently, not louder, not aggressive, just grounded. And grounded people are difficult to shake. They don't know about the networks you're building, the skills you're refining, The resilience you're stacking layer by layer. They're still measuring you based on outdated information. And outdated information leads to flawed strategy. That's why they'll miscalculate again. They'll approach you expecting the same access, the same reactions, the same vulnerability. But evolution is silent until it's undeniable. The most powerful transformations aren't announced, they're revealed. One day they'll speak to you and realize the old triggers don't work. They'll test boundaries and discover there are consequences now. They'll look for hesitation and find clarity. And in that moment, the imbalance they relied on will feel unfamiliar. They don't know who you're becoming because they stopped observing once they assumed control. They thought the story had already been written. What they failed to understand is that you were still writing, still refining, still rising, and the version of you they underestimated no longer exists.